Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Need Some Introduction. In today's episode, Sona and I will be discussing the most recent episode of the Apple TV Plus series Disclaimer, the fifth episode, simply called Roman numeral 5. We have 2 more episodes to go, and I've also been reading the book in conjunction with watching the series, and I'm going to compare and contrast the way these stories are being told. We'll be covering the series for 2 more weeks, and then Apple TV Plus has some more content to look forward to. Another season of Bad Sisters, which I will be covering to some degree here on the podcast. Silo, also on Apple TV Plus, will be coming back in November. I believe the exact same week that we get the new Dune prequel series, which I'll also be discussing here. That's around the time that Penguin will be wrapping up its season, and I will be reviewing that season of television here as well. But before all of that, with only a week left before Halloween, less than a week at this point, do expect to hear a pretty long episode of the podcast where I discuss with a couple of different guests this year's horror offerings, which are not over yet. There's still yet more to come. Make sure you subscribe so you'll be notified when all that content becomes available. Check out my Letterboxd if you'd like to see more lists of recommendations. Check the show notes for the link. And of course, email us, needssomeintroduction@gmail.com. Okay, let's get into that conversation. All right, Sona. So before we discuss episode 5 of Disclaimer, I have begun reading the book. I think I've read a little bit past where we are in the show, and it's a pretty faithful adaptation. I had kind of speculated in the last conversation whether this really was maybe a looser adaptation. This is very much a transcription of what's happening in the book, other than the way that the story is told, like the sequence of events that are being explained. It's very, very similar to what we've seen in the book. We open with Catherine receiving the book or seeing it on her nightstand. She reads it. She's vomiting like in the very first moments of the novel in recognizing herself in the story or the version of it that she's reading. And then we jump in the very next chapter to Stephen's POV. I had read that it's a huge mystery. We don't even know that Stephen's the one who brought her the book until well more than half of the novel or something. That's not true at all. I think it's within the first chapter, you probably imply it. And I think by the 4th chapter or so, and these are short chapters, it's explicit, right? So it's very faithful. The one thing that's very different structurally is we don't hear about the contents of the book. And it is indeed the contents of the book, the flashback that we're seeing of the lovers on this vacation 20 years earlier, that is interspersed throughout the series. I actually had presumed that we might have a whole book within a book, like chapters of it, like in The World According to Garp, for example. And that's not what happens at all. We see somebody reading the book, the husband, and it's his summary of it. So that is to speak to some of the awkwardness of some of those flashback sequences, I think have been put in there by the filmmaker. So maybe some of those decisions that I thought were, well, he's being faithful to the book. I think he's fleshed out things in maybe a way that aren't the best, but I'll get into a little more of that as we go forward.
Well, what's interesting, and this would be true of both the TV show and the book, but I just didn't think about it until you were talking just now, is, we've got this theory that what happened in reality is completely different from what we're being shown in the flashback. But yet she can recognize herself in the book. Everybody can recognize her in this book, except maybe her son. And it causes her a physical reaction. And I'm not sure how to reconcile those two ideas.
We get a little more insight into that because we get her interior monologue, and I'll touch on that here in the recap. But you make a really good point, which I thought as well, where it's very easy for me to read the book and also to see what's happening on the screen and think she's getting railroaded. But of course, it's the fact that very early in the show, and literally the opening scene of the book, she is throwing up in having read the book. And she even describes in this interior monologue, she was like, she wasn't even sure why she kept reading the book. It seemed to be not really her kind of thing, but it was interesting enough to keep pulling her through. And then as the story evolves, as you would expect from what we've seen, that, maybe 2nd or 3rd or 4th chapter in is when this older woman shows up. And that's when she started to realize the book was about her. But then, of course, like you said, she's recognizing some aspects of herself here. And she even says, how could they know? There was some element of her not being only uncomfortable with what's in the book, but that she's not even saying that, well, none of this happened. She's saying, how could they have known that, right? Like she's literally saying this internally.
Because I would think if I were in a position that somebody wrote a book describing me but
Right.
then filled in some section of my past with something wildly different than what had
Right.
actually
Right.
happened, my reaction would just be like, what the F? Like,
Right.
that is so far divorced from the actual truth of the matter. And I might even be angry about it because I know that people that don't know the real story will read it and assume that it's true. But I
Right.
wouldn't have like a revulsion that would cause me to throw up.
Yeah, it's striking a nerve, that's for sure,
Yeah,
and
right.
that's explicit. And there's a little bit more in that, in line with that, in her interior monologue. I think intriguingly that she over and over again, after she's read the book and she gets sick. This is very early in the book, by the way. She is having this interior conversation with herself, basically saying that there's no way now. She's still trying to do like damage control. There's no way she can now explain herself to Robert, her
Mm-hmm.
husband. And she says if she had just addressed it at the time, she
Mm-hmm.
feels like it would have been an easy conversation to have, but
Uh-huh.
now it's an impossible conversation to have. And she
Mm-hmm.
multiple times in the book, when she's trying to confront him with it and she doesn't know what to say, she says it's gotten to a point where like the cover up is bigger than the crime
Yeah.
in a way, right? As often is the case.
Oh, so
So
often.
but it still is very intriguing to me. What could this have been? Like, if she is fully non-culpable in the situation, then it should be a pretty easy conversation to have. So there's some complex. I
Yeah.
have to say that I am still, and I've intentionally been unspoiled on the book. I still
Right.
cannot imagine what the reveal would be that would fit all this criteria.
Right. Right. Exactly.
Unfortunately, if I had to guess at this point, I have a feeling that it's not going to be very satisfying. Like it would be something that, like, really, that's what she couldn't say,
Mm.
or vice versa, where it'd be like
Mm-hmm.
something where, um, like to your point, it would have been something where she really is a victim and everything's been misconstrued. And then I'm like, if that's the case, to your original point, why would she be so upset about telling anyone about it when what did she do wrong, right? Like
Right.
why is she still
Exactly.
unable to have this conversation? And of course, circles all the way back to a piece of dialogue which is not in the book, and not so far anyway, but was at the end of episode 4, where she says, "I wanted him dead." Right. So that is, that you must really hate somebody if you want them dead. Obviously, it's not like I want him dead just because inconvenient conversation to have. That's not really a good reason to want someone to
It's
die.
just easier for me.
Right.
Yes.
Once again, I don't know if this whole thing's going to be satisfying or not, but if anyone's interested in reading along with the book, I actually would recommend the book. I've heard people describe it as being trashy. I think these are people who haven't read the book. It's actually very well written, I thought. It is much above these type of women's lit type thrillers. I think it's significantly better than that. It's maybe that's the analogy to Gone Girl, where people make this comparison, where it's probably like a cut above in that genre of writing, I would say. And that definitely is the case here as well, I think. And an interesting theme that for me hasn't expressed itself in the series yet, but I think it's foundational to the book, this idea how a marriage can look ideal from the outside, which of course we talked about the perfect couple here, which doesn't do this very well either. But in the book itself, there is this very interesting idea that this marriage is perfect on the outside. And not only is it perfect to people who are watching it from the outside, but the people inside the marriage themselves are
Mm-hmm.
happy with this relationship. And in their own heads, they might have a different version of that relationship, and how this grenade literally thrown into it, starts to unravel the relationship completely. And it's simply because whatever your interior version of the story is cannot doesn't work anymore because of this exterior point of view. And I think that's really interesting, because I think that's something that, I think one of the main themes of the book is this idea that you can be inside of a marriage, and that it can be a successful marriage or any kind of relationship because you have an interior narrative about what the relationship is, and
Mm-hmm.
how all of that can be broken apart basically by this, external point of view, right? Like how this book, literally someone has written a narrative about your history, and how that now causes this rift within the marriage, because it's, in a way, your interior narratives can't hold together anymore.
Is that true though? Or would you just say, I mean, we've talked so many times on this podcast about my perspective that no one knows what a marriage is or a relationship is except the two people in it.
Right.
So to me, I would kind of dismiss it as like, well, of course, that's, what it looks like from their third party perspective. They have no idea what really goes on in this relationship.
I agree with that. But I think what's interesting in the unraveling of the marriage is how this external point of view forces their competing narratives to bump up against each other, that they have kind of an equilibrium. And I mean, I think this is true of all relationships, right? You have like an equilibrium and then how something can, unbalance it. And that could be anything, right? I mean,
Yes,
having a children,
yes.
right? Or changing
Sure.
Your career trajectory can have these things as well. But I find it interesting that I think this is explicitly exploring that idea, that just a different, like if you just have to say your narratives out loud, basically, that they may fall apart, right?
Sure.
Okay, so here's some more logistical things that I think you'd be interested in. There's two narrators in the book, and the one narrator says she when they are talking about Catherine.
Oh, here
they
we go.
He
okay.
when they're talking about but I think you'll like that, right? So
yes.
They say she when they're talking about Catherine.
I do like that. Yeah.
He when they're talking about Robert. So basically, when they're talking about the couple and their child, for example, it's he, it's her, right? They're talking about the family, and of course, Stephen's narrative is I. That is the same, but we don't have the three different points of view, right? Which is very confusing and not in the book. So I'm not sure if maybe that'll be a revelation or something unique to this series, that there is yet another perspective. But the book has two, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, the you perspective is particularly grating for me, the second person one, for whatever reason.
Yes, and that is different. When the novel opens and she's throwing up, it literally says she felt sick and ran to the bathroom, right? So it's all talking about her in that voice. It's very faithful, even in the details. For example, there is the scene where Stephen decides to celebrate, and instead of having his usual cheese sandwich that he has every single day, he decides to break out the old marmalade and scrapes off the funkiness off the top and then spreads it on there. And he finds one of his wife's hairs, and he decides that, aha, I'm on the right trail. She's talking to me through her marmalade, right? That literally happens in the book. So it's like right from the book. So it's even those little details are very accurate. Another thing that I assumed was just, hey, I like the way this looks. Struck me, I probably wouldn't have thought of it much if I hadn't seen the show first. She describes her office space, and she says that her office space is also a big open space, which is what she likes, just like her home. So I'm like, okay, well, even the set decoration apparently is faithful to the book.
Interesting.
One thing that is different is that they're in Mallorca instead of in Spain.
I'm sorry, you mean instead of in Italy, right?
I'm sorry. Yes, Mallorca instead of in Italy. Yes, correct. They're in Mallorca, Spain instead of Italy. So that's different, obviously. Not important other than, I don't know, maybe they got a tax break by shooting it.
Yeah, strange thing to change. Okay.
Or he really wanted to visit Italy. One of those things. Early on in the book, when Stephen is researching Catherine, he sees her biography and how she made her reputation by focusing her journalism on the exploitation of children. And of course, he relishes, by the way, when he sees that she has this reputation. He says, oh, the delicious irony that she won some award for some documentary about people who are like teachers who are grooming their kids or something like that, or mentors who are grooming these girls. Because he, of course, in his mind, theoretically, he thinks that his son was groomed potentially by this woman. Even though he's 19 years old, by the way. So that's another thing I want to mention. So it's explicitly said in the book, he's like on a gap year. The parents have bought him an apartment. This is a little different than what we see. I think that studio or his room was still inside the parents' house, if I remember.
Yes, on the show. That was my sense of it. Yes.
Maybe because they don't want to make him look as rich as they potentially are, because what they are describing here is that the son is traveling the world. He has pictures in his apartment of the places he's traveled to. So he's probably been traveling for a year on and off or more, maybe. He's 19 years old. So he's probably at least a year into this world traveling photography endeavor he's on. And they have bought him an apartment close to their house because they want him to stay nearby. If they figure if he has an apartment, he'll eventually settle by here. And then we'll convince him to go to university, which is what they want him to do, right? And hopefully nearby, right? So they can still have a relationship with him. They were older when they had him, which kind of makes sense if we were saying, well, he's maybe 60 years old in the flashback. Right. Apparently, this was a surprise birth. They were older, but they were happy to have him because they had no other children. So that all kind of adds some pathos to the circumstance they found themselves in. And of course, wanting to keep him close as he got older. But that's where he was at. So he's kind of aimless.
Mm-hmm.
But he's not 17 or anything like
Right.
that. He's 19 years old explicitly. And by the way, the actor, I did some math. The actor is currently 21, which means that when he was shooting this, he'd probably be 20 or 19. So it all kind of makes sense.
And do they say how old Catherine is?
Catherine is 50. She turns 50. So that means
What?
that she's 50. Yes.
In the flashback in Spain?
Oh, no. She's 50 years old. She's turning 50 in the current tense of the book. So
Okay.
25 years ago, she would have been, I'm sorry, 20 years ago, she would have been 30.
Okay. And
she's not 30 yet, something like that. She's approaching 50. She's still under 50.
And how about Nicholas?
Nicholas was 5, so that's the same.
Okay.
That's the same. This is a random detail, but in the book, she meets with the mom 15 years earlier, not 9 years earlier.
Okay.
I'm not sure why that difference occurs, but.
Did the mom already have cancer when she met with Catherine?
She did have cancer, yes, when she met with Catherine. And it's the same as in the book. So when she meets Catherine and she assumes the husband is dead, she says to Catherine that I lost my husband, which of course Catherine assumed that meant that he was dead. And this is Stephen's interpretation of it after the fact, when she had heard that from his wife. So he's assuming things as well, that she never said my husband is dead, but said that she had lost her husband. We see all this in the book. She gets more and more depressed. She gets obsessed with the son. At one point, he starts thinking that she's been in his apartment and cleaning up his stuff. So she's ready to move on. They're about to go on a walk together, which they do every single day. He goes upstairs and finds her in the bathtub fully clothed, which we see in the TV series.
Mm-hmm.
And this is when it's the moment where he's kind of fed up and he wants her to kind of start to get past all of this. And then, of course, he decides to not push her at all. And then she starts spending more and more time at the apartment, which in this version in the book is not even where he lives. So they're not even living together for years. This happens.
Right.
And at first he's allowed to go to the apartment, and eventually she locks him out of the apartment. So she's living basically a fantasy life in amongst her son's things and having no communication with anybody on the outside world. And then she gets cancer and she gets worse and worse and worse. And then eventually the neighbors call him. This is more detailed than this in the series. The neighbor contact him because they know he's still around, because he used to hop by, even though he's disappeared for a period of time. She's very, very sick. Eventually the EMTs, their version of the EMTs, have to come and rescue her. Then he reclaims her from the hospital or whatever. She moves back in with him. He nurses her. She gets stronger. But then she eventually dies of cancer. She just doesn't die immediately. So they actually spend about 2 years together at the end of her life. So that kind of explains some of the strangeness where I was like, were they living together? Were they not living together? Like they actually were living apart. But they did come together basically just as she was dying. All of this is very sad details, by the way.
Very
and it's
sad.
all told from Stephen's point of view in a very angry tone, as you would, because I think he's lashing out. So he wants someone to blame.
Yeah.
Okay, this is something that we don't have full details on, but not only is Nicholas 25 years old, we hear from Robert, from the father's point of view, that the son had always had trouble in school, was unfocused, and was always getting into trouble, not for any kind of vandalism or whatever, but just not connecting with the material, not caring, just being bored all the time at school. So he'd always kind of underperformed as a student, and he dropped out of school at 16 years old. 16.
Oh. I'm not sure if it's a gap year then.
Just like in the series, he now lives in this apartment. Everybody he lives with are actual students. So he's living with 18, 19, 20-year-old students, although he's 25 and obviously not a student, but he's living like, student housing basically.
Oh, I see. I'm sorry. We switched children. Okay. I missed it. Okay.
Yes.
I'm with you now. Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Gotcha.
This is Nicholas,
the
Catherine's son.
Yeah. No, you said that. I just missed it. Okay.
I won't go into details here because it might be relevant to why we haven't seen it yet. But rather than trying to know, what happens to the Catherine version of her character in the book, because we know she's dead at the end, and the son is and she deserves it, we do know how she dies in the book pretty early on. But once again, I won't reveal it here because maybe it somehow will play into the end game here. So,
is it grim though?
It might be grim, but we don't read a description of it. We just hear it in passing. Okay. So we know what happens to the person. It's something that could be considered an accident. So that she's paranoid in public that there's someone behind her, something going to happen.
Interesting.
A couple other minor details here. Robert is just a lawyer at this charity. He's not a member, and he's not as well off Potentially. I mean, I guess he could still be rich as a lawyer, but I think it's different if you're managing tens of millions of
Yeah.
dollars of your family's money. It indicates a level of wealth that maybe, just being a lawyer that works for one of these families could definitely be wealthy, but not the same level of wealth, obviously.
Right.
And they do have a good marriage. Early on, when she is when planning to make him dinner that night, she, in her interior monologue, or at least this version of it, who knows if this narrative is legitimate or not, thinks about how she still likes to spend time with her husband more than anybody else. They look forward to their date time together. She likes being alone in the house again because, they have more time together. She actually is legitimately happy in her relationship and respects him a lot.
Mm-hmm.
She does feel, however, that she's the one who tends the marriage more. She makes this commentary at one point that he thinks he's strong, but she has to keep things from him. And that's part of the reason that there is a little animosity there, where she feels like she's the one who always had to be tough with the son and make him do his schoolwork and try to get him to participate. And he always got to be the one that kind of was just like, hey, let's go watch a soccer game together or whatever. So they always had that, the duality that we see there, but there's a little more context to it. And that he's the peacemaker, the husband, apparently because his parents were divorced, and in that relationship, he was always the peacemaker. So he always is doing that. He's always trying to smooth things over. And she's always the one who has to be like the tougher parent. And she is a little resentful of that. And then, of course, that's what makes her son potentially harden towards her.
Mm.
So interestingly, going all the way back to the beginning of the conversation, she does feel guilty from the start, like after she throws up, and she feels guilty about what happened. We don't know all the details of that, obviously, but she also feels guilty, like I mentioned before, of not having told Robert previously. If she had just come back from the vacation and upfront about everything, that it probably wouldn't have been that big of a deal, and it would have been gone now. And now it's this thing that can destroy her. But once again, I'm very curious to know what that would be that would not be so bad in the past, but is worse now. Like, I'm all
definitely
confused.
not what we saw. That would have been
right, exactly,
pretty bad.
right, exactly. I don't think he would have been okay with all. Oh, that's all right.
Right.
But she feels like she shielded her son. One of the main reasons she didn't mention this, she primarily says that she did not want to address this or make it a bigger deal than it was at the time, because she feels like she's protected her son from that memory. And she goes, if he has any memories of that summer, they're probably pleasant memories. She did indeed. She became a journalist 20 years earlier, and she decided to not be a stay-at-home mom, which was a little disappointment to the husband. And what's interesting about it is that she admits that part of the reason she obviously wanted to restart her career, but part of the reason that she wanted to be out of the house and not spend as much time with the son was because of what had happened. So this thing really did create some kind of rift between her and her son.
Interesting.
I mean, it could just be like the reminders of the events, I'm sure. Yeah, I mentioned some of these things, the timeline. She's about to turn 50. This happened about 20 years earlier. So she was about 30 at the time, or even I think she's not 30 yet. So still, that's the other thing I consider too. She's still like in her 20s. Like, you're a very different person in your 20s than in your 50s. Like, it's a huge difference, right? And she met with Nancy 15 years earlier. I'm not sure, instead of the 9, which they have in the book, in the series, I should say. I'm not sure why they make that change, other than maybe so Catherine doesn't have to play 15 years younger, or I should say, so that the actress doesn't have to play 15 years younger. And she was already living at the son's apartment at that point. The sex scenes are not as egregious mostly because we don't hear them in detail. We don't actually read the whole thing, but it doesn't seem to be anywhere near as explicit as what we saw here. Although it does seem to be that there is still some mentoring by the female, character. Oh, and the event itself, they do have sex in the bathroom. They do go and lay down on the beach separately afterwards. This is the day of the actual incident. But rather than the way they present it in the series, where she just wakes up and he's in the middle of the ocean and everything's already happening, the description in the book is that they see it happen, basically, right? That the son is by the edge of the water. The water is coming in. He's now floating. They're still laying on the beach. And they start to notice, basically, both her and the boy, Jonathan. Was Jonathan his name? The 19-year-old. The water's rough and it's starting to pull him out. And then she starts to freak out and is calling out. And then Jonathan reacts and goes and tries to rescue the son. And there's a tone in the book of like, of course he would do anything for her, which I'm like, well, he's only been with her for one night. I'm not sure if we might be overreading into that a little bit. That's the way it's presented, that he, basically she screams and she starts to see it happen. And by the time he gets to the son, he's not that far out, but then he's holding onto the raft and they're now both being pulled out. And then the other men show up and rescue them. And as they're pulling him back, Jonathan falls off the raft, basically, or like he's holding onto the rope. He's not on the raft; he's just holding onto the rope, which we did see in the representation of it in the series. And then they basically leave him behind, and I guess they assumed he could swim back. And of course, they're so fixated on the sun that they don't notice. And then by the time they do, it's too late. Oh, but the mark on his arm, by the way, comes from him holding the rope. That's where the mark came from on his arm. So
okay, then.
So nothing too nefarious there, which makes perfect sense. You can imagine if the rope is
like cutting into you.
Exactly. There's his hand is in the book. We don't see all this detail in the series, but they notice that his hand is all roughed up, and they notice a line that goes down his arm, the length of his arm. I
see.
And that's the rope, basically. So
I see.
Although we don't realize that until we get to that moment in the book where they describe it. Well, maybe this is the last thing to touch on is Robert himself in his internal narration when he's in that meeting. Once again, this is a very literal transcription of what's happening in the book. We even have that meeting where he is distracted and not really listening to this important case that he should be paying attention to, where he interrogates himself and says, why is he getting so upset? This book is written by someone who obviously has an agenda to go after. Like, I'm reading a version of the story from someone who has it out for her.
Yes.
Right. And so he's fully aware of this. But then when he comes to the decision to kick her out, exactly the same in both the book and the series, he says, but then why did she keep this from him? And this goes back to the very first question you asked at the very beginning of this conversation, which is the same thing, right? It's just like, of course, I'm aware that this is a biased point of view, but why have you kept this to yourself for so long? We've been together for 20 years. You never told me anything happened there. How long, like what's been going on? And of course, if you don't trust someone about something like this, then you may just start to distrust them in general, right? There are a couple more details that are more like creepy character details, which I'm not going to touch on here. They're not important clues. They're more like character details that I think may actually pop up in the later episodes. So I'll leave them to be surprises for you.
Okay.
With that out of the way, let's start discussing this 5th episode of the season. Before we break down episode 5, I had a couple of follow-up points. One was I saw Scream 2. I saw Smile 2.
I too have seen Scream 2.
That's true. Yes. A very long time ago. I saw Smile 2, and I thought it was as good as the original. There were certain things I liked better about the original. Probably just the novelty of the concept was more fun the first time around.
Sure.
This is a much bigger budget. It was a tiny budget for the first film. It looks great. Some of the production values are very high, and the central performance is very, very good. But the novelty of it wore out a little bit for me. Also, they keep cranking up the tension. There's fewer jump scares, which is a plus. And they keep cranking up the tension. And for me, the temperature gets too hot too early, right? It's like it starts to grate on me. I'm like, okay. It's like
I get it.
I capped out my, the amount I could invest in the whole thing. And it's over 2 hours long. I mean, this thing it should have been tighter, I think, tighter. Like
almost every movie these days.
True. I mean, especially for a horror movie.
I feel about that.
Speaking of, I said especially in horror movie.
Yeah.
Especially, but speaking of going too long, we'll have to talk about what's going on with this TV show.
Fair.
One more thing to bring up very briefly. 2 episodes of that show before are available, and they are only half an hour long. And I only watched one of these, and I'm like, I am not going to watch any more of this show. I am so out on this show.
Remind me which one that is. I can't even remember at this point.
It's Billy Crystal. There's he's like child psychiatrist, and
that looks good.
It's I'm going to tell you right now that this might opt you in or
it's
out.
Not.
2 things. One is I found the episode just so obtuse and just trying to go for something and not succeeding. The Billy Crystal performance, I think it's just my own bias. He's not working as a dramatic actor. He's not giving a bad performance. I just can't square that circle.
Mhm.
And there's a kid who keeps having these episodes, and the show basically is definitely supernatural. So I think if you're out on that, you'll
Uh,
be out on that.
okay.
Yeah, and then the worst part about it is there were no reviews for this thing. So I'm like, interesting that Apple makes these screeners available, but no one's reviewed it. And then just today, I started seeing a handful of reviews, and every single one of them was negative. First of all, and second of all, they all say like that. Basically, the payoff is completely generic supernatural thriller, and every episode ends with the same cliffhanger, right? And I'm like, oof, I didn't like episode one. I don't want to see 10 Sona, 10 episodes of the same, not five, 10.
Oh boy.
I cannot recommend anyone invest in this. Not having seen the rest of it, but I mean, none of those pointers. If you used my
Right.
word as any kind of litmus test, I'd say wait till all of them are available and
Gotcha.
then hear what the word of mouth is, because I do not think this is going to be enjoyable week to week. And by the way, 30-minute investment in something that I don't really have to pay attention to that much. I'd love to have that type of show. This apparently is not it, because it was like nails on a chalkboard the whole time for me.
Maybe that's a job for shrinking.
Yes. Oh, that's one more thing we could talk about. I think I'm caught up on the new season of Shrinking. I think I've seen 3 episodes. I think that's all that is available. Or
I
I'm
think I'm
behind.
one behind you.
Yeah. Nice to see them all here. Interesting that they bring in, once again, the Ted Lasso DNA in this show.
Roy
Roy.
Kent.
Yeah, that's right. They bring Roy Kent from Ted Lasso in as, I won't even spoil who he is, but he has I think he's going to be a pretty prominent aspect of this trauma that the family is dealing with.
I agree.
Also, I said that there was a murder at the end of last season, but apparently not a murder.
Right, right.
Just an attempted murder.
They say it's a miracle he survived.
That's right. Yeah, when you see that, you assume he's dead. I'm enjoying it so far. That's definitely something that I am not hugely vested in, but it's enjoyable. So,
Agree.
and maybe we'll spend a few minutes here to talk about what is going on with the Apple TV experiment, because man, it's like they have these prestigious on paper, sounds good, and then somehow these things are all missing. And I don't think people, I mean, Presumed Innocent, I think was a modest success for them, but probably not a very cheap show. So what is even successful nowadays by
Yeah.
the standards of Apple TV? One thing that definitely has to be a hit for them, and we did see finally a trailer for this. Maybe we could talk about that for a minute. A trailer for Severance season 2, which we
Yes.
saw just this week. What did you think about this conceit for season 2 based on that little teaser? Basically, at the end of last season, no spoilers here if you haven't caught up with it, but we were speculating, listen to our podcast episodes about it, like what do they do in season 2? And you can reset them back to day one. And I'm like, oh my God, that is actually such a simple solution to what's happened. I think it's pretty brilliant, actually.
I felt from the trailer the same complaint I always have lately, because there is so much time between seasons.
Yeah.
It's like I'm watching stuff going, wait, I have a vague memory of what this is referencing, but I'm not entirely sure. And so I kind of struggled with the trailer for that reason.
Right.
I'm trying to figure out, wait, who's new? Were they there last season?
Right,
You know,
right.
a lot of that going on for me, but that, could be a me problem.
I actually, speaking of that, I actually plan to republish our conversations, just probably put them at the end of some of the upcoming episodes leading up to the premiere of that show, which is going to be mid-January 17th, I believe it
17th, I think. Yeah.
So mid-January. So I will be republishing those conversations and probably revisiting the show, because I need to refresh my memory.
Yeah. Who can remember what happened, really? Except for, that main cliffhanger.
Right, the big cliffhanger, exactly.
Yeah. Even I was able to retain that.
It's a good cliffhanger.
Yeah.
All right. Let's talk about this episode of show. I have some positive things to say. Some.
It's beautiful.
It really is. I was thinking about just scrubbing through the episode again to take some notes. That opening scene where it's raining and she steps out of that cab, and just beautiful, like the sky, the colors, her reflection on the ground, like the way it's reflected off the wet cobblestone, all of it just impeccable. But so many script problems in this show. But early on, I actually thought that was pretty sweet. The whole narrative, which a lot of it is lifted from the book, by the way, I've read through this section as well, that her with her mother and how, she's back in, and we all have had that experience, right, of being with our parents and how we're like a different version of ourselves there. And also like the mother dealing with losing memory, and how not only do we all, not all of us, but many of us have to deal with that as our parents get older. But also, of course, that this, here's this irony that the mother is forgetting the present and reverting to the past. And here's, she's trying to escape this story from her past. So I thought all of that was kind of dramatic irony that I thought was pretty well done.
The idea of like unburdening yourself is
Yes.
really
Yes.
nice. Although it did make me wonder because Catherine seems like the type of person that would have a therapist.
Good point. Yes.
Why she hasn't talked with a therapist about this, I think that would have helped her a lot, but neither here nor there.
It's a good point because I think that I forget if it's in the show or in the novel that at least the husband, I believe, has been in therapy. So that's a very good point. Maybe this is a very pro therapy show. Who knows? That'll be the payoff at the end. If we just talked about this earlier.
Yes.
I think that is going to be part of the payoff of the show, by the way. Okay, positive number 2. The cats are back. All right, we got cats back.
Cats everywhere this time.
Yes, I know. They both have cats, right?
Yep.
By the way, this is such a literal adaptation of the book that sequence where he is looking down on his dad as he washes the dishes is literally out of the book. So it's interesting that they found a house that can actually accommodate this this particular sequence.
Right.
Earlier on, there was this internal monologue of the son and how you would see it counterpointed to, this is in the book, not in the series, that counterpointed to the way that the parents perceive him and how in his head he kind of plays dumb and naive, but he's actually being like, my parents are so dumb. They don't know what's going on inside my head. But now in the show, for the first time, we have a little bit of that interiority. And it turns out that he is not only kind of a mess, he is perhaps definitely a self-hating addict as well, right?
I was really surprised by the addict reveal, honestly. Right. He seemed kind of like a typical listless 20-something, but I didn't think there was something darker beyond that.
And then you wonder when the addiction, the heroin aspect of this, I didn't even call this out in the one of the previous episodes, but there's a whole sequence where the dad seems reluctant to even admit to himself at how disappointed he is with how his son has turned out. And this doesn't happen in the book, but it happens in the series where he walks in on his son trying to put his socks on very slowly. And I was just like, oof. Dad, I need a few more minutes to put my socks on. It's like, oh man. And like that, but now that in the context of perhaps he has an addiction problem, that might explain a little bit more of that.
Right.
But primarily, this episode is about Steven's broader plan all coming together. We see that he is not only out to stir the pot as far as the marriage goes, he wants to go after her reputation, her career, and of course, he wants to go after her son too, which all plays out here where he's created this fake profile. It's funny, the book is probably 10 years old or written, maybe the book is probably like 7 or 8 years old, but it takes place in 2013. So he does create a Facebook profile. I like these little revisions where it actually says, I'm going to set up a Facebook profile, which is right out of the book. And then says, but kids don't use Facebook anymore. Right. So they've modernized it a little bit.
Funny.
Yeah. And then he does the same thing. He befriends him, shares the photographs. All that happens in the book as well. And of course, this makes the kid really despondent. And that is kind of where there's poignancy in the show, as convoluted as so much of this is. And honestly, as minor as I think the revelations that are going to come will actually end up being in the context of the show. I'm sure they're personally traumatic, but they're not, cataclysmic in the history of twist endings of a show. My gut instinct is these like gut punches of this kid who's dealing with the fact that he has some kind of guilt of underperforming. And now to have the added weight of this thing that he didn't even remember, that someone sacrificed their lives to rescue him. And of course, like is this added burden for someone who probably already has extremely low self-esteem. Mm-hmm. And like Steven says, I just need a little nudge. And this, I can't imagine he knows just how desperate this kid is, but the nudge is pretty significant, right?
Yeah.
He ODs, I assume.
I mean, yeah, it's a very dark ending to this episode.
One thing that I definitely want us to talk about is what happens to her when her whole entire office turns against her. This, by the way, is much worse in the TV series than it is in the novel. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, is like this seems to be some kind of commentary against cancel culture or something, or at least potentially these types of office cultures now where there is this hypersensitivity perhaps to these types of things. Like, what did you think? How did you feel about that whole sequence where like basically everybody in the office is just immediately against her?
I mean, first of all, her assistant literally says as the elevator door is closing,
Right.
"You're
Yes.
canceled," right?
Right.
So it's
Which is
kind of a
not in
direct
the which
shout
is not
out.
in the book. This is the obvious.
Yeah.
This is
I
the
mean,
basic.
that phrase didn't even exist
Right.
in 2013. I questioned logistically how everybody in an office would be able to drop everything and read the book
Just
and
read a book.
absorb it in a way that would allow them to judge her by the time
Right.
she got in. Like, it just seemed unlikely to me. I guess like word could spread like wildfire
Right.
if one person had time to be like, okay, just go to these pages and then read
Right.
that part, right? So
Yeah. Right.
I guess it logistically could happen. I did feel for her in that scene. And I think even the voiceover that I hate makes a good point of
Right.
like, she could have been pulled into a meeting room, a conference room, rather than having this conversation in this very open plan office with
Right.
her boss, supervisor. I'm not entirely sure what's happening there, but about the situation.
Right.
She's already been beaten down by what's been happening at home. And so this was very hard to watch in that way. I don't know how realistic it is because you would think, especially in journalism, people would kind of be keeping an open mind and
Right. Right.
vetting it and kind of asking questions about like, well, how do we know this is real? And, what makes us trust what this person says? I mean, I feel like they kind of all piled on too quickly, but then
Right.
a lot of people love to take others down a peg. They love to see the person on the pedestal fall. And I think there was even some kind of comment about that.
I think it's in Steven's voiceover where he says he can't believe how quickly all her friends have turned against him.
So maybe.
It just seems very pointedly that Cuarón is trying to say something here, although I haven't heard of anything publicly where he's really gone after cancel culture itself. But the reason I mention that is because it is a little more naturalistic in the book. They do take her aside. She does feel betrayed by the girl. He does start to ask questions about, well, why did you have her do the investigation? And then you decided to not do the investigation. And then she tries to defend herself saying, I never said he was. I just didn't not say he was, so that is the pedophile accusation. So all of that does look suspicious. And it is clear in the book as well that she does not have a good relationship with this man in her office, her manager, who she doesn't see as someone who's just kind of inherited the role and doesn't really do anything creative. So she has this kind of negative opinion of him as well. And he has, even though he plays like everybody's friend, he is that type of manager that really does have some animosity towards her. And the violent confrontation is really her just pulling away. She doesn't actually slap him or anything like that. And the whole, like, everyone's taking videos of her and stuff. All of that is manufactured for the show. And as a matter of fact, by the time she gets back to her mother's house, the HR person calls her up, and it's not like she's fired and she's made a spectacle of herself. They call her up and they're like, do you need some mental health time? And she starts saying, oh, I think I can do this or work from home. And they're like, just take a couple of weeks off. But it's not like the end of the world like they do make it here, which I think is, I guess they're trying to drive home that point, but making it such a kind of public spectacle where everybody pulls out their cameras. First thing they do seems to be like he's making some kind of cultural commentary there. I have to say that it's probably unintentional. What I thought was, how does this woman have no friends at work? What does that say about her? Like no one takes her side. It makes me very suspicious that she's a good friend to these people if they're willing to throw her under the bus within seconds. I think the point is to kind of create a nightmare scenario for people who are in similar positions of power. And but that's not how I read it. I'm like, nobody likes you. Might say something about your character, lady.
Funny.
What'd you think about the scene where she shows up and she's talking to him through the mail slot and he's cowering from her? That's one thing I think that did happen in this episode of TV, which hasn't been indicated before, but is definitely indicated in the book itself, that Stephen may be, like you're saying, that these stakes seem relatively low. Stephen may just be a really petty guy and probably mentally unstable, right? And I think this is the first time that we've seen him as a truly unsympathetic character.
He's been unsympathetic to me this entire time.
But I mean, I shouldn't say he has been sympathetic. You could understand where his anger came from earlier, but now at this point, he just seems completely unhinged.
Yes, but also, I mean, I had said a few weeks ago, right, that, or maybe it was only last week, that there really isn't anyone likable here.
Oh, no,
and that,
exactly.
That usually isn't an issue for me. I actually am interested in unlikable characters usually. But for some reason here, it's just not super working for me in the way that it normally does. I mean, the whole thing with the roach in the glass, by the way, what kind of weird,
Yes.
symbolic, ongoing theme is that? Anyway, one thing that kind of leads to where you just asked me about this conversation. I'm not sure if we discussed it on the podcast. That voicemail message that Catherine leaves for him when she
Right.
first reads the book. Did we discuss that? I can't remember.
I don't think we did. No, that's a good point if you want to bring it up.
Because I remember at that time, the message she left, and that I was very neutral, essentially. And I remember the narrator saying that Catherine thinks she's done the right thing. This should put an end to it, essentially. Right. And I was like, that's, I mean, Catherine should be a fairly perceptive person, being in the line of work that she's in and understands psychology. And I mean, I understand she's got a lot of emotions that are at play here, but what would drive her to leave a message like that? I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was just like, I read the book.
Yeah, it's a very interesting book, and but she basically, as if it's completely fictionalized. And yeah,
I mean, so I think to the extent that, I do struggle with understanding this need for vengeance, although it is a horrible, horrible thing that happened. I could see that message angering him further, for sure. Given that's not the reaction he was looking for whatsoever.
Once again, it works better for me in the book because it explains how you make these incidental decisions that have repercussions you can't imagine. And what happens there is, his friend sets up the website, they do the self-publishing, and this is actually in the series itself. He's like, oh, we're going to set up a website so you can sell directly. And Stephen says, little does he know that I have no intention of selling this to anybody. I don't really care about selling this book.
Yes.
But it does have a website that was created for him by the same guy who set up his Facebook profile in this particular episode, or Instagram. And that is, context of both things. Anyway, so she goes there, she creates a fake profile, just an anonymous profile. And she writes basically what she says in the phone, going, what an interesting narrative, blah, blah, blah. And similarly says this is an interesting fictionalization of certain events. And then she signs it with not her name. She signs it with the name of the character in the book. Right. And then in her head, when she's deciding how to sign it, she goes, I want him to know it's me. How would I sign this? I don't want to put my name on it. So in her head, it seems rational. But then when he reads it, he goes, what is this? This is going to be enough to placate me. And how dare she sign it as the character in the book? Is she acknowledging that that's what happened? So it's really, frustrating for him when he reads it. Yeah.
So I do think this conversation between them is, he should have been anticipating that, no?
Right.
Right? I mean, especially after she kind of maybe inadvertently provoked even further vitriol than he already had.
I mean, it's so hard to even have some of these conversations without me mentioning what is pretty clear, I think, is going to happen by the end. But regardless, let's just put it in the context that I think she feels like she is the wrong person. And she keeps being outraged that no one's taking her side. But she is hesitant to explain that she's the one who's been wronged. And it's that shock of how she's being perceived versus the reality of the situation, which I think is probably honest, right? This is a person who's been running away from this for 20 years of her life. Even if that is sincere, I just don't know if you can watch a protagonist just sit there and take it for week after week after week without just opening her mouth and saying these words already. Even when, and by the way, this happens in the book as well, but it was more irritating in the series where she's begins to tell her story and then the narrator comes in and goes, she told her the whole story.
Yes.
I'm I just want to hear the story already.
Yes.
You are messing with me now, narrator. Anyway, it's tough. So I don't know if you had other things you want to touch on. One big one that I think we need to talk about is, and this is where the show in a way is failing, I think, is in all the speculation we did just one episode ago. I edited that episode. I think we spent half of the time speculating on the future.
Yes.
And all of these possible narratives. Something that is subtly happening in this episode for the first time is all these narratives that I thought were competing narratives are all merging together, because now all these people are in the same timeline. They're all interacting with the same people, like literally in the office. That's happening in two different narrations within the same day. So those two things are all happening now. So I don't think they are alternate narratives. And of course, the other point is the photographs that the son receives now are the ones that clearly show the other actress's face, and he recognizes it as his mom. So I'm like, okay, all these things that we were forgiving the show for, or I was anyway, are not holding together. Like, this is another problem with the way this show is. The more I see of the show, the more disenfranchised they am with what's happened here.
Yeah, it is strange. And I wonder if we have seen the last of the flashbacks with the iris.
Right. Good point. We didn't see that this week.
Opening and closing, because there were none in this episode. But yeah, it's becoming hard to reconcile everything they've set in motion, kind of just being like hand waved. I mean, I feel like we're almost at this point. Are there 2 episodes left?
2 more, yep.
It's really hard for me that they haven't shown us the true story of what happened, because I feel like the longer they go without doing that, the more I accept that what I've shown is very close to what really happened.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Or it's a story construction problem, because whatever is left has got to be amazing.
Right.
Then, if you're waiting until the end to tell me. And it's hard for me to imagine what could be that amazing at this point.
All right, I'm going to segue that into the next part of my conversation here, because I think so much of watching this show makes me think about just like the conundrum we all live in now is like, it's so hard to pick and choose what will be worth watching, basically.
Yes.
And, this is still early to make this assessment, but I'm not sure this show is worth watching, and definitely, almost certainly not worth watching in this way. And I say this as a way to maybe set your expectations. In the book, I've read as far as we've gotten. I've actually read a little bit past. I'm pretty sure I've seen pretty much everything that's going to be in the next episode. And I do think we're going to start to see her story. This is where it comes into the whole conversation of the right way or wrong way of watching something. So much of my expectations here were Cuarón and his talent, and why would he be telling the story?
Yeah.
The payoff, I think, is going to be relatively minor stakes. So I think I want you to set your expectations there, because watching this week to week and discussing it, I assume the stakes are going to be big, which goes back to maybe the point I made in the very first episode, that perhaps the best way to have seen this is to binge it all, where you're like,
Right.
well, what's going on? So that when you get to the end, you're like, oh, wow, that's not what I was expecting at all. It's not as deflating as investing like a month in something and being like, well, that's what we get at the end,
Yeah.
And I think really that's where I'm going to land at the end. And by the way, even here and there, the show is able to, land an emotional gut punch. So maybe we'll still have those in the finale. I just don't know if this entire process was worth like watching it in a week to week.
Yeah.
And I blame myself for building it up in my own head and putting it here on the show and being like, we're going to watch this week to week, which is my own conundrum. That's my cross to bear only. Most people are probably going to binge this at the end. And that's probably, honestly, I would tell most people listening to this that it's probably bad for our weekly downloads, but you may just want to wait for the end to finally see the finale. That might be the best way to consume this. But also it's the fact that I don't understand how, speaking of the Apple TV of it all, I don't understand where some shows really should be going week to week and building word of mouth. Like a perfect example of this, I know your husband is watching the show Penguin.
Yeah.
I started watching it and I was like, okay, it's like, it's a mob movie set in Gotham City. Okay, fine. That's a little, different. But I almost opted out after episode 2 or something. But week to week, they've changed what the show is. And the ratings have been going up week over week over week. So people are talking about like, ooh, did you see what happened last week? You'll be surprised. It's not what you expect, right? So it's, and when I say not what you expect, it's not like twists. It's that the show itself has become a different type of show. And I think that's part of this cultural conversation. It works for a show like that. For this, which is like, you have to be very patient and then we're going to punch you in the gut at the end. You can't make people wait a month. It doesn't work. They should have put this out as a binge. Once again, I just think that this should be a binge. I mean, they do this every time. We do 2 episodes up front and then the rest goes week to week. And by the way, they modified it a little bit by doing 2 and then 2 and then going 1 and 1. They should have just done it in 2 weeks or something like that. I think if they had done it 3 episodes 1 week and then maybe 2 and 2 or 3 and 4, like made it very quick, that it probably would have generated a lot of buzz and people would have tuned in. I think the show, like week to week, is probably losing audience members, I would assume. And by the way, it's not only the way that the reviews for the series were written, it's even the book. When I was researching, everybody's like, wait till the ending of this book. The book is a short book, so it's a very quick read. Me dragging out the way I read the book as well. I could easily have read it in 2 days if I wasn't stopping to stay pace with the series. All of this has been prelude to what I'm about to say, which is I'm not going to spoil this here. Unlike the way it's sold, like wait till you get to the final reveal in this book, it has been hinted at that I am pretty sure I know exactly what the ending's going to be because the book has been hinting at it earlier.
I see.
So once again, I think that the book was probably something you would read very quickly, and the show should have been something you watch very quickly. I think that would have been a more effective way to experience the whole thing.
Yeah, I could see that, especially if they're not going to have some huge reveal at the end here.
Yeah, it's not going to be some kind of like unique twist to it, to be honest. I mean, from a plot perspective, not a unique twist. Maybe the way you tell the story is unique, but not the plot twist is not like, I can't believe I've never thought of that before. It's like, in very general terms, reading the book is showing you a narrative, making you invest in the particular narrative, and then reversing your expectations, right? And when I say that is that these stakes are extremely personal, but not world shattering. Yeah, and that all remains to be seen. We are close to the end. Maybe we'll start seeing some hints of the real story, but I have a feeling that the final episode is going to be unpacking that whole real story. Most likely it's going to be a conversation between Catherine and Stephen, but I don't think that's going to be next episode. I actually think it's going to be the final episode. So,
Oy,
indeed. I almost was thinking that we skip next week and only discuss the finale. That might be a better way to address it. But from a production standpoint, they're actually releasing next week's episode early. They're releasing it the day before Halloween so that, because Halloween's on Thursday. So it would actually make it very easy for us to watch it and then probably get this episode out at a regular time. So we will probably have another conversation. And honestly, that will probably be our shortest conversation because I have a feeling that it's going to be pretty uneventful. And everything that we want to unpack is going to happen in the final episode, which is just 2 weeks away. So take all that with a grain of salt. You may not want to listen to our next conversation and just leave it all to the finale. But speaking of, I was thinking, given the fact that next week was probably going to be then this happens and this happens type recap with very little meat on the bones, I was going to open it up to you if you wanted to discuss something else, like something that we might, that this might remind you of, like a better version of this. That we talk about Gone Girl. We can still, you feel free to suggest it and we can talk about that, rewatch something and talk about it there. Because like I said, I have a feeling next week's episode is probably going to be like a 40-minute episode and it's just going to be like plot. And then it's going to end with Catherine and Stephen in his house together or something. Yep. All right. So I will talk to you soon.
Sounds good. Take care.
Take care.
Bye.